In 1950s America, a nation torn between promises and prejudice, a new kind of hero emerged in comic books. These characters weren't fighting aliens or supervillains, they were fighting for a place in a world that refused to accept them. Mutants like Black Panther or Storm were born with powers that made them outsiders. Their struggles mirrored the real-world battles of African Americans, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups fighting for equality. This video is not just about superheroes. It's about how a story of mutants in a world that hates them became a mirror for a real struggle for justice in America. What do you think that story looks like? We're going to explore how the X-Men's journey, through fear, discrimination, and the fight for recognition, echoes the real-life battle for civil rights. It's a story of identity, power, and the courage to be yourself. So what do mutants and civil rights have in common? More than you might think. And that's exactly what we're going to uncover, one beat at a time. So what exactly are we talking about? The X-Men aren't just mutants. They are symbols of otherness, of being different in a world that often fears and rejects difference. This isn't just a story about superpowers. It's a story about identity, about the struggle to be seen, to be accepted, and to exist without being erased. The X-Men were created in the 1960s, a time when America was reckoning with its own identity, its own history of exclusion and segregation. Their struggles mirror the real struggles of Black Americans, indigenous peoples, and all those who have been marginalized for simply being different. This isn't just a comic book. It's a mirror held up to history, reflecting the pain, the courage, and the hope of those who dared to be different. There's a quiet truth buried in the stories we tell. The heroes we admire often mirror the struggles we've tried to forget. When you watch X-Men, you're not just seeing mutants. You're seeing a reflection of the American experience, one shaped by fear, exclusion, and the slow march toward justice. The X-Men are not just a group of superpowered beings. They are a metaphor for those who were once seen as other, forced to hide their true selves in a world that feared them. This is the same story of Black Americans, LGBTQ+ people, and anyone who has ever been told they didn't belong. You might not realize it, but when you see Magneto fight for mutant rights, you're witnessing a version of the Black Panther fighting for the rights of his people. Both are leaders in a movement that faces resistance, distrust, and violence from the very society they are trying to change. The X-Men story isn't just about superheroes, it's about the people who have always stood at the margins, fighting for their place in society. And if you've ever felt like you didn't quite fit, you might find yourself in their story. That's why you should secretly care about this. The 1950s were a time of quiet resistance, when the struggle for equality was waged in classrooms, churches, and courtrooms. The civil rights movement was not a single moment, but a sustained, collective effort to dismantle centuries of oppression. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest, was the first major victory of the movement. It showed that ordinary people could challenge injustice through unity and discipline. But the movement faced violent resistance, from police brutality to bombings. It was a war fought in the streets, and it demanded courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in justice. The civil rights movement was not just about race. It was about power, about who gets to decide the rules of society. And it was about the courage to challenge those rules, even when the cost was high. The movement's legacy is still alive today. It reminds us that change is possible, but it requires the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to believe in a future where everyone is free. X-Men isn't just about superpowers. It's about people being different and standing up for what's right, even when the world says they are not welcome. The X-Men fight for a world that doesn't understand them. Just like people who fought for civil rights, they had to face hatred and fear. Mutants are like the civil rights movement. They are seen as outsiders, but they have the same dreams and deserve the same rights. The X-Men show that being different isn't a weakness. It's a strength, just like the courage it took to fight for equality. Both stories teach us that change starts with people who believe in justice, even when the world is against them. The story begins in a world divided, where some are born with the power to change the world, and others are born into a society that sees them as threats. This is not just a tale of mutants, but of those who were once seen as outsiders, and the struggle for acceptance that has echoed through history. In the X-Men comics, the mutants are born with abilities that set them apart, much like how African Americans were born into a nation that denied them equality. Both groups were seen as different, and both were forced to navigate a world that wasn't ready for them. The world that the X-Men live in is one where they are constantly hunted, much like the Black community was hunted by the forces of segregation and oppression. The very idea of being different is seen as a danger, not a gift. But even in the darkest of times, hope remains. The X-Men are not just a group of outcasts, they are the spark of a movement, the voice of the voiceless, and the embodiment of the struggle for a better world. This is the first step in the journey, the setup. A world built on division, a people born into struggle, and a future that has yet to be written. This is where the story begins, and where the fight for justice has always begun. The first step is to understand the foundation, the roots of the struggle. Just as the X-Men were born from a society that feared and rejected them, so too did the civil rights movement emerge from a nation that feared and rejected Black Americans. The X-Men were created as mutants, not as villains, yet their existence was a threat to the natural order. Similarly, Black Americans were seen as a threat to the status quo of white supremacy. The X-Men were given a purpose, to protect and to serve, even as society tried to destroy them. The civil rights movement, too, was given a purpose, to demand equality, to fight for dignity, even as the world tried to silence it. Both movements relied on a shared truth. That difference is not a weakness, but a strength. That to be seen as a threat is to be seen as a force of change. In both cases, the struggle was not about power, but about belonging. About being allowed to stand, to speak, to live as full human beings. The clever twist is not just in the story, but in the way it mirrors the real world. It takes the struggle for equality and turns it into a battle for survival, where the very act of being different is a threat to the status quo. X-Men doesn't just depict discrimination, it weaponizes it. The mutant gene becomes a symbol of the African American experience, where identity is both a strength and a source of fear and exclusion. The X-Men's struggle is not just for rights, but for recognition. It's about being seen not just as a symbol, but as a full human being with a right to exist without being forced to hide. This twist is both literal and metaphorical. It forces the audience to confront the reality that the fight for equality is not just about justice, but about survival. In this way, X-Men becomes more than a superhero story. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the pain and pride of those who have fought for a place in a world that refused to see them. The X-Men are not just mutants, they are the result of a hidden biological experiment. Their mutations are not random, they are the product of centuries of genetic evolution, shaped by forces we cannot fully understand. In the 1950s, when the world was still reeling from the atomic age, the idea of human mutation was not just science fiction. It was a fear of the unknown, a mirror to the horrors of war and the uncharted future. The mutants in X-Men are not just outsiders, they are the natural consequence of a world that has long rejected what it does not understand. Their powers are a metaphor for the unseen, the unacknowledged, the marginalized. The science of mutation is not just biology, it is the science of identity, of belonging, of the struggle to be seen. The X-Men are a testament to the idea that difference is not a flaw, but a form of life. In the end, the X-Men story is not just about superpowers, it is about the quiet, persistent fight for dignity in a world that refuses to see you. It is a story written in the margins, but it is a story that cannot be ignored. The X-Men are mutants, but they're also people. Just like Black people in America, they are seen as different, and that difference is used to justify exclusion. The government didn't just ban mutant rights, it created a system where they were invisible, labeled, and controlled. Just like the Jim Crow laws that governed Black lives, mutants were told they were dangerous, but they were also told they were the future. And just like the dream of equality, that future was always in reach, but never easy to grasp. The X-Men are not just a story about power. They're a story about the courage it takes to be seen, to be heard, and to demand a place in the world that was never meant for you. In the end, the X-Men are not just mutants. They're the echoes of every person who ever stood up against the odds, and that makes their story more powerful than any superpower. There's a moment in the X-Men story that feels like it was written in a dream, but it's rooted in reality. The idea of a mutant as a symbol of the other was not just fiction. It was a mirror to the real-world struggle of Black Americans, Jews, and others who were told they were different, and that difference was a threat. Mutants were born with a trait that made them different, just as Black Americans were born into a society that saw them as different. Both groups faced violence, hatred, and the weight of a system that refused to see them as equal. The X-Men's struggle for acceptance was not just about being seen, it was about being allowed to exist without fear. This is the same fight that Black Americans faced, and still face, in a society that often forgets the cost of exclusion. So when you read the X-Men story, remember that some of the most powerful moments are not just about superheroes, they're about real people, real pain, and real hope. The fiction is a reflection of the truth, and the truth is still being written. Myth number 1 is that the X-Men are just a group of mutants in a comic book. But in reality, they're a metaphor for marginalized groups, like the civil rights movement, fighting for equality in a world that fears and rejects them. The X-Men's struggles mirror the real-life battles of African Americans, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other minorities. They face prejudice, violence, and exclusion, just as those in the civil rights movement did. The X-Men's leader, Professor X, embodies the hope and leadership of civil rights figures like Martin Luther King Jr., advocating for peace and justice through non-violent resistance. But the X-Men also face betrayal and violence, just as civil rights activists did. Their story is not just about heroism, but about the price of fighting for a better world. So when we look at the X-Men, we're not just looking at superheroes. We're seeing a reflection of real people, real struggles, and real courage in the face of oppression. Myth number 2 is that the X-Men are a metaphor for the civil rights movement, but that's not entirely true. They're more about the struggle for acceptance in a world that fears the unknown. The civil rights movement was about fighting for equality, voting rights, and dignity. X-Men, while powerful, are fighting for coexistence and understanding in a society that sees them as threats. X-Men's struggle is more about the fear of the other, the idea that difference is a threat. That's not exactly what the civil rights movement was about, though it did face similar fears. So while there are parallels, the X-Men aren't a direct metaphor for the civil rights movement. They represent a different kind of struggle, one that's more about identity and belonging in a world that doesn't understand you. Understanding the difference between these struggles is important. It helps us see how fear and misunderstanding have shaped both worlds, and how the fight for acceptance is never easy. Every day we walk through doors that were once locked by fear, but opened by courage. The same quiet resistance that shaped the civil rights movement lives in the choices we make, the voices we amplify, and the silence we break. In the classroom, in the workplace, in the streets, the fight for dignity is still unfolding. It's in the way we stand up for someone, the way we refuse to let silence be the default, and the way we demand to be seen as more than a label. We carry the legacy of those who came before us in our shoulders, in our voices, in our courage. The movement didn't end, it evolved, and it's still happening in the spaces we don't always see. The X-Men remind us that the fight is not just for equality, but for humanity. It's about seeing the world as it is and choosing to believe in a world that can be better, because that's what justice looks like. In the late 1950s, a young black student named Barbara Johns stood before a panel of white officials in Maryland, demanding better schools for black children. Her quiet courage would eventually spark a legal battle that would change the nation. Her case, Briggs v. Elliott, was part of a larger movement, but it faced fierce resistance. The system was designed to keep black people in place, and it was not ready to change. The NAACP lawyers, led by Thurgood Marshall, took her case to the Supreme Court. It was a gamble, but one that would eventually lead to the landmark decision Brown v. Board of Education. The ruling came in 1954, but the fight wasn't over. Across the country, segregationists resisted with violence and intimidation, determined to hold onto the status quo. Barbara Johns never got the school she fought for, but her story became a symbol of the struggle for equality. It was a real-world example that went surprisingly hard, but it was necessary. The X-Men's story isn't just about mutants, it's about the power of difference. It's about standing up when the world tries to silence you. It's about being seen as less but choosing to be more. The comics didn't just mirror real-world struggles, they amplified them. They gave voice to the voiceless and made the marginalized heroes. It was a revolution in storytelling, and it started with a black, Jewish, queer writer at Marvel. The X-Men weren't just a fictional movement, they were a blueprint for real change. They showed that even in the face of hatred, unity and courage could break chains that seemed unbreakable. Their story is a reminder that the fight for equality is never just about the present, it's about the future. It's about who gets to decide what is possible and who gets to be seen as human. And so, the X-Men didn't just break the rules of fiction, they broke the rules of society. They turned the idea of difference from a weakness into a strength, and from a fear into a force for change. The world that once celebrated their courage now turns its back. The streets that echoed with hope now whisper with fear. Leaders are called traitors, and the message is clear: they are not welcome here. The fight for equality is now seen as a threat to the status quo. The media turns its lens to the violence, not the injustice. The story becomes one of chaos, not of courage. The narrative is twisted to serve a different cause. The government, once a voice for progress, now becomes a tool of oppression. The laws change, and the scales tip toward control rather than change. The dream is deferred, and the path to freedom is blocked. The silence grows louder, and the truth is buried under the weight of fear and conformity. The X-Men aren't just mutants, they are the ones society refuses to see. Just like the civil rights movement, they are fighting for visibility, dignity, and a place in the world that's built to exclude them. But the system doesn't change overnight. The same way Jim Crow laws kept people in chains, the same way prejudice still lingers, the world tries to ignore the ones it doesn't want to face. The X-Men are told they are unnatural, that they don't belong. The civil rights movement was told they were too much, too loud, too demanding. The world doesn't want to acknowledge the pain of being different, and yet they keep showing up. They keep fighting, even when the world tries to erase them. The struggle is real, and it's not just about power, it's about being seen and being allowed to be whole. Before you go, if you enjoyed this, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell us in the comments what you'd like us to make next. We read every single one. Thank you so much for watching. Comment this emoji if you made it to the end.